Kia ora, and welcome to my chorus for Monday, September the 8th. I'm Bernard Hickey for the Kaka. This is a video and podcast that goes out with my email newsletter via Substack. It's called The Kaka. It's all about Aotearoa's political economy around housing, climate and poverty. I wanted to talk today about the politics part of the political economy, and in particular the role and future of New Zealand First, which won 6.08% of the vote in 2023, which gave it 8 seats, and which Christopher Luxon believed he needed to accommodate within his coalition fully in cabinet, with the leader, New Zealand First leader, Winston Peters, as Deputy Prime Minister, at least for the first 18 months, and with a whole range of New Zealand First policies included within the government's coalition agreement, and quite a bit of influence for a party which was on track during much of the election campaign to actually be not in Parliament at all. So it's worth looking at what they're planning for the next election. And over the weekend, New Zealand First had its annual conference in Palmerston North, where a whole bunch of people attended, and New Zealand First leader Winston Peters and his anointed successor Shane Jones were talking up the party's policies and approach before the election. In my view, effectively, it was relaunching New Zealand First election campaign, particularly in the second half of the Parliament, where Winston Peters is no longer the Deputy Prime Minister, although he is still Rail Minister and Foreign Minister, so he's well and truly within the Cabinet. And he's going out there to raise New Zealand First's profile and to appeal to a particular audience. Now, there's a few policy news items from the speech. In particular, he has said New Zealand First wanted to reduce migration, although he didn't give specifics on that. He only talked about having a smart migration policy. Secondly, he wanted to have a new Kiwi values statement that new migrants would have to swear to, a so-called flag saluting values statement. And it was part of a range of comments in the speech, essentially attacking what Winston Peters called woke values, woke politicians, woke policies. In fact, the word woke was used by Winston Peters 19 times in his speech. And what he's doing here is appealing to a group of voters, quite a small group actually, who have particular views on issues around the treaty, around road cones, around cycle lanes, around vaccinations, around mandates, that got a lot of traction and a lot of attention in 2021 and 2022 when we had the vaccinations and mandates for COVID, and a whole bunch of people started believing that vaccinations were not just ineffective but dangerous, and that the mandates put in place by the government to encourage vaccinations were bad. A whole bunch of other allegations and views fueled by discussion on social media. And that led to, through 2023, the formation of a whole bunch of small parties around people who had won a bit of a following for themselves during COVID and were against the Labor government's policies and against the Labor government and against a whole bunch of things, particularly against this idea of woke, which they believed was, taking the country away from them, and they wanted to take the country back. So interestingly, at that point, Winston Peters was around the 4 to 5% mark in the polls. And what we saw through early 2023 was a group of people who were involved in these anti-vaxx and anti-mandate movements, who realised there was a risk that their votes, and some of them were getting up towards the 1% mark, would be wasted because they were unlikely to get an electorate, and unless they get to 5%, your vote is wasted. And that, in effect, did happen with a few of the party votes, Freedom NZ, Democracy NZ, a few of those. But a group of people realised they had a potential to get some of their policies into a new coalition agreement by supporting one or the other of the smaller, more right-wing parties, and in this case, New Zealand First and ACT. An initial attempt to get into act, if you like, was rebuffed by David Seymour, and a group of these campaigners decided to instead try to team up with New Zealand First. Essentially say to New Zealand First, you adopt these policies, for example, reopening the Royal Commission into COVID, pulling out of various UN policies on public health, changing the rules on food safety to allow a lot more natural products in, and also opposing genetic modification, among many other things. And we saw that reflected in the coalition document after these votes were essentially pledged to New Zealand First. To give you an idea of the scale and how important it was, remember that New Zealand First got 6.08%. And I wanted to share a presentation with you which has some detail on these issues. So as we say there, Winston doubling down on woke, using it 19 times in his speech, and including this Kiwi values pledge. But here's the detail on the election results, showing that New Zealand First got just over 170,000 votes, and that was enough to get it to that 6.089% mark. Now remember, under 5%, so 4.99%, New Zealand First is not only irrelevant, they're out of Parliament, not in government, and the election result might have looked quite different. And that gap is around about 30,000 votes. And it's clear from looking at the votes that went to some of the smaller parties, about half of the anti-vaxx and anti-mandate votes eventually shifted into New Zealand First. And we're seeing that reflected in the comments from New Zealand First about this issue of woke and against migration, and doing things like calling for a Kiwi values pledge. And interestingly, pushing for a 10% compulsory KiwiSaver plan offset by tax cuts. Again, not mentioned the detail of these tax cuts and no mention of how they'd be paid for. But just to give you a heads up on the likely influence and tactics of New Zealand First going into the election, appealing to that relatively small group. But again, it was it was not just statistically significant, it was electorally significant, because you only really needed, for Winston Peters and New Zealand First, about 30,000 votes to get that influence in Parliament. I've included some links to articles through 2023 and 2024 about the way that this campaign was organised and the celebration of anti-vaxxers and anti-mandate candidates upon the election result and getting a lot of their policies into the coalition agreement through New Zealand First. And also just pointing to news over the weekend, which you might not have seen, reported by Newsroom, that the government's plans to liberalise the genetic modification rules to allow more genetic modification has been effectively blocked by New Zealand First in Parliament because many of the anti-vax, anti-mandate candidates are also very opposed to genetic modification. If you think of the sorts of policies, they're the sorts of policies that the RFK junior element of the Republican Party are very in favour of. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was today's chorus on Monday, the 8th of September for the Kaka. Ka kite anō.